Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief for March 24th, 2023. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. If you're catching this on Apple or Spotify podcast, I'm going to be covering, as I do each week, stories that are in the news that have either a legal angle that is underappreciated or as a central feature of the story itself. And this week I'm going to be looking at a few national stories, including the resignation of Liberal MP Han Dong, Supreme Court of Canada case, McCollman, Supreme Court of Canada year in review, and Ontario case, an employment case that I think people find interesting. Also, the National Citizens Inquiry was in Nova Scotia this week, and they're traveling across the country over the next few weeks, so I'll talk about that a little bit. But some Nova Scotia situations as well. I'm going to start off with the Mass Casualty Commission update. Their report's coming out next week in Truro, and it's going to be released. And they released some new documents this week, strangely in a sense. And then the last thing I want to talk about is this incident that was in the news all week. This was the violence, knife incident at C.P. Allen High School in Bedford, Nova Scotia, just outside Halifax. And some of the legal aspects of that, and I guess some systemic aspects as well. I was listening to a couple of interviews on the radio with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union president, and I've been following that as well, and some comments from the prosecutor. So I'll talk about that at the end, but I'm going to start, actually, before I get to the stories, the Mass Casualty Commission will be the first main story. We'll talk about two other things quickly. Just yesterday, I'll have to dig into this a little more, there was a report issued by the Parliamentary Committee on the Electoral Boundaries adjustments that the parliamentarians are making. And the committee, so the Federal Boundaries Commission, an independent third-party commission, has made a report recommending changes to the boundaries in Nova Scotia based on population and communities of interest, those sorts of things. The government MPs that are the majority of this committee have voted to change that and recommended that the commission go back to the original boundaries, or the previous boundaries, current boundaries, I guess you'd say. And so this really strikes of political interference. I'm going to dig into that a little more and see more about what the report is actually saying. But certainly seems problematic from a democratic point of view, seems to be sliding into American-style gerrymandering. The other story I wanted to, somebody sent this to me, actually my brother sent this to me, and then I see David Fraser from McGinnis Cooper, privacy lawyer, commenting on this as well, and this is Afroman. So the Afroman is a rapper. He lives in Ohio, and his house was raided last year in 2022 on suspicion of drug trafficking, actually, and suspicion of kidnapping as well. None of those charges were either laid or stuck. They were all dropped if they were. I don't think the charges were even laid themselves. But the police raided, and Afroman wasn't home at the time, but he had video of all this, and so he started using some of this video of the botched raid in his songs and his music videos. And so the officers are alleging that they have faced embarrassment, ridicule, humiliation, and loss of reputation from Afroman's post. Oh yeah, so he was never charged with a crime, and no copyright issues with the footage because it's his footage. And so, but the police are suing about this. I don't think that's going to go well for them. Certainly wouldn't in Canada. You have the right to video the police if they're in the course of their duties, and as long as you're not doing anything defamatory or manipulating it to an unacceptable extent, then I don't see any problem with Afroman using the videos from his home in his music video. So we'll see. Not a rapper that's on my playlists, but an interesting news story out of the States. Okay, so let's get to the main stories. First of all, it's the Mass Casualty Commission update. March 30th, next Thursday, is going to be when the release is taking place of the report. I'm going to be there in Truro. It's going to be 12 noon when the commissioners will release the report. I noticed they put out a press release on their website yesterday. They're still coy for some reason about the length of the report. It strikes me as impossible to say at this point that they don't know the exact length of the report, but they say the report is between 2,000 and 3,000 pages. That is a huge range. That's that's War and Peace, Brothers Karamazov style range. There's 1,000 pages. I don't know why they're doing that, why they're coy about it, but they are. So, what can we expect on the day of the release? The commissioners are being very, not careful, but they're being clear that they don't expect much analysis or digestion of this report to take place immediately. They're not providing it to anybody in advance. They're not providing it to the parties or the media in advance of the release. So nobody's going to be ready to react to it in a thorough sense at the time. So what might happen? I expect very little, just based on their interim report, based on the comments that the commissioners have made when they were sitting in hearing. I don't expect that they're going to get into their recommendations. Certainly, I don't expect that they're going to recommend anything all that controversial anyway, but I don't think they're going to get into detail about here's what we're recommending. I think what they're going to do basically is go through the chapter titles, which they've already provided. They'll issue some, platitudes, acknowledgements, thank yous, and that'll be it. Everybody will be off to read the report. And I think they're going to be trying to caution people, urge people to read the report slowly, digest it all in, over the course of weeks, and then, everybody put their shoulder to the grindstone and work on implementing their recommendations. Well, I think it's going to take more than that. It's going to take some selling and persuading on the part of the commissioners and the part of somebody. The commissioners now have said that their work is done once this report is released. So who is going to be promoting the report? Who is going to be the ones that are urging people to follow through with it? It's not quite clear. And I'll come around to this because, all right, so the Department of Justice, the Nova Scotia Department of Justice has released its budget plan, its business plan for the next year as part of the Nova Scotia budget that was tabled yesterday. And so I'll come around to that in a second. Well, why don't I say it now? The budget, the Nova Scotia Department of Justice budget plan, business plan for next year, although apparently they have budgeted $11 million for implementation or something to do with the Mass Casualty Commission, $11.2 million according to a report that was sent to me. But it's not mentioned in the Department of Justice's business plan that they'll do anything about the Mass Casualty Commission, about policing structure. None of that is included in their budget plan. Of course, they don't have the report yet, so maybe they just left it out for that reason, but it's not in there. And I'll come back to that in a second. But one other thing about the Mass Casualty Commission first, they released new documents. Well, they're not new documents. The one I want to talk about is this, and it was in the news today as well. I noticed in the Herald had a piece on it. The Baseline Intelligence Assessment of Firearms Smuggling in Atlantic Canada. Smuggling across the U.S.-Canada border. Well, this was a major issue. Well, it was an underexplored major issue during the Mass Casualty Commission. I mentioned this multiple times in my coverage of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings that, they were going to all of these other issues that were of just marginal relevance. But one of the main problems with Wortman was he was smuggling firearms across the Canada-U.S. border. He was picking them up in Maine, taking them to his home in Nova Scotia, and there he had them. So, here we have this new document, a baseline intelligence assessment that is dated from July 23rd, 2020, almost 3 years ago. So soon after the shootings, this report was done. And what it talks about is that the Maine-New Brunswick border is a big problem. Maine is ranked as an F by this U.S. organization that assesses different states and how they treat firearms and how easy it is to get firearms illegally or on a black market. Maine is one of the easiest places to get firearms. And then the border between Maine and New Brunswick is completely porous. They had between 2015 and 2020, 121 firearms seized at the border. It's considered a low-tiered priority, or at least it was until 2020, soon after the mass shooting. None of these 121 firearms were found by deep concealment in vehicles. So that's within the vehicle itself, within a gas tank, which is apparently a very common way of smuggling firearms across the border, which of course suggests, and the report concludes this, that nobody's really looking deep in vehicles for firearms. So it seems like that is just an open invitation, in a sense, to smuggle firearms across that part of the U.S.-Canada border. So something that really needs to be addressed, should be commented upon in the Mass Casualty Commission's final report, but just amazing to me that this report, which was available in 2020, July 2020, wasn't part of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. I mean, it was a major issue, and they spent, days and days talking about stuff that was just marginal. Okay, so we'll see what happens next week. I'll be there for the report. Looking forward to seeing everybody, I guess, in a final time with the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. The Nova Scotia budget, provincial budget, was released yesterday. Priorities for the Department of Justice are the Wortley report, which was dealing with race-based data for police stops. They're putting that into further action. Connected with that, in a sense, is the African Nova Scotian Justice Action Plan, which is underway, and they're going to continue work on that. Engagement on an Indigenous Justice Action Strategy. Not quite clear what that's going to mean, but that's they're going to be talking to Indigenous communities and leaders about that. Transitional housing for reintegrating into society. So basically halfway houses and resources, mental health supports and other resources for that. Preventing human trafficking, that had its own section. It was a very short, by the way, a short report. It was only 6 pages, and some of those were financial statements. Preventing human trafficking, modernizing freedom of information systems, working to make Nova Scotia more accessible by 2030, and then modernizing the court system with a digital task force. So digital electronic filing of documents, which would be a very welcome thing for lawyers and litigants across the province. As I said, not mentioned anything about the Mass Casualty Commission, anything about policing, anything along those lines. All right, so that's the sort of Nova Scotia Provincial Court or Provincial Department of Justice budget plan. Next thing I want to mention, this was in Nova Scotia, but it's a national thing, is this National Citizens Inquiry. I've talked about this before. It was, I guess, initiated, it seemed to have been initiated by Preston Manning, or at least he was involved in that. But it's a private, not-for-profit organization. They're seeking donations and funding for this, but it's an inquiry into the government response to the pandemic. And it was in Truro. It's private. It's not government funded or sanctioned. It is privately funded, but they're getting in experts and witnesses to talk about how the pandemic affected them, and vaccine issues, lockdown issues, civil liberties issues, all of those things. Many questions arising from the pandemic. But it was in Truro, March 16th to 18th, so over March break, maybe not an ideal time. Some social media reverberation from their Facebook posts and Twitter posts, but not particularly well publicized, I would say. There's no news stories that I saw, even though one of the guests he videoed into the session was Jordan Peterson. So you'd think that in itself would have drawn significant attention, but it didn't. The inquiry is proceeding on to Toronto, Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and Red Deer. And anyway, it's hard to know exactly what to make of it. I didn't watch the hearings themselves in great detail. I caught some of the witnesses. Anyway, maybe not everybody wants to reflect on COVID just yet, but there does seem to be many questions yet to be asked, and now we're able to ask them. I mean, geez, the whole origins of the pandemic with the lab in Wuhan, the Wuhan lab, used to be racist to just suggest that maybe it came from that lab that was studying the pandemic or studying COVID, but now it seems to be accepted as the most likely outcome. So, inflation issues, economic issues, all of that stuff. So anyway, hopefully a credible report comes from this citizens inquiry. But I think they have to do a better job of getting people's attention. I mean, we used to say when I was head of the Chamber of Commerce in the Strait area, like, if nobody knows your job, if you're an advocacy organization and nobody knows what you've done, then you didn't do it. That's as simple as that. All right, so that was the National Citizens Inquiry. We'll see how their further hearings go, if they're publicized better and get a little more media attention as they go along. All right, the next story I wanted to mention was this Han Dong resignation. Han Dong is a Liberal MP from the Toronto area, and the allegation against him, well, there's some CSIS, the Canadian spy agency, suggesting that he was speaking to Chinese officials about holding back releasing of the Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who were held as hostages by the Chinese government. And here we have a government MP that was dealing with Chinese officials, and perhaps the allegation, at least, is that he was talking to them about, just wait, don't release them yet. This is to our political advantage to release them at a certain time or whatever. Anyway, so question I saw on Twitter from journalist Stephen Maher was, does this count as treason? You're working basically against your own citizens in favor of, I guess that's the question. Is it treason? Not quite, in my view. There's criminal code defines treason and defines high treason. Now, high treason is when you're trying to actually kill the king, queen, it was king now, or take part in a war against Canada. That's high treason. Now, treason is if you're trying to overthrow the government, if you share military or scientific information that's prejudicial to the safety or defense of Canada, or if you conspire or form the intent to do any of those above things. So, serious things too, you get life in prison for it. But to me, it seems that these definitions are all limited to, or focused at least on, military issues, or at least military adjacent issues. So I don't see this being raised to that level, but certainly a major political issue for the government. All right, I just thought I'd address that question, the legal question there. I don't want to get into the rest of the political elements of that one too much. Next story I want to talk about, though, is a national issue as well. This was an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, an impaired driving appeal, and it was an 8-0 decision. By the way, Justice Brown, who is facing some allegations out of a trip he took to a conference in Arizona where he was allegedly drinking and being a little, rude to, his questions about his behavior, if he was harassing people that were involved or that were attending the conference. After the conference was over, he's defended himself. But anyway, he's not taking part in decisions at this point. But it's R.V. McColman, M-C-C-O-L-M-A-N. He was driving a four-wheeler, and he was pulled over in his driveway. This was in Ontario, and he admitted that he had maybe up to 10 beer. He threw up, he vomited in front of the officers, and then he blew 120 and 110 when he was put on the breathalyzer. Okay, so bad stuff, but he was found guilty at trial, but not guilty, or sorry, it was overturned on appeal to the Superior Court, and then the Ontario Court of Appeal supported that, and so it went to the Supreme Court of Canada. The issue is this: in Ontario, the police have the authority to make a random stop. If they they can stop any driver. The problem was that the courts of appeal identified was that he was in his driveway. He wasn't on a highway. So therefore, if you're not driving a vehicle on a public highway, you're not considered a quote-unquote driver for the purposes of the legislation to allow the random stop. So that was the issue in the Court of Appeal, and they said, well, that's a charter breach to your Section 9 charter right to be free from arbitrary detention or imprisonment. Well, Supreme Court of Canada agreed with that part of it, that it was indeed a violation of the driver's Section 9 charter rights. However, they allowed the evidence. So in any charter case, there's two elements to it. First, you determine, well, was the charter right breached? And then the secondary thing is, well, if the charter right was breached, should the evidence then be excluded? And that's not always the case. And it's, you look at, well, how bad was the violation, how serious is the allegation, and then how reliable is the evidence. Here, the Supreme Court of Canada says the evidence is very reliable, and it was done without malicious intent by the officers, and impaired driving is very serious. So on balance, the evidence should be included. I guess think about this in other contexts. I mean, that's particular in a sense to the Ontario legislation, but I think other courts in other provinces are going to look at this and say, well, it's an indication from the Supreme Court of Canada that yes, if there's a charter breach, but the evidence is reliable on an impaired driving case, that the balance is going to tip in favor of inclusion of evidence. So we'll see how that goes on future cases. All right, next thing I want to talk about is the Supreme Court of Canada. Again, I'll just stay with the Supreme Court for a moment. They issued a year in review document, 36-page long, lots of pictures and graphics, well done thing. Unusual. They've only started doing these year in review things in the last few years. And Chief Justice Wagner has the message in there, and it's a lot of talk about the independence of the court, reminding people of the role of the court as an independent body that adjudicates government issues and serious cases from across the country. They get about 500 a year applications to hear cases at the Supreme Court, and only hear like 30-40 of those cases. So it's a low percentage, high threshold to get to the Supreme Court. Have to be of national importance, or there's some automatically that go if you have a dissenting view in the Provincial Court of Appeal, then in some cases automatically go to the Supreme Court. And of course the federal government can refer cases to the Supreme Court of Canada. They talked about the trip to Quebec City. There was a week where the Supreme Court sat in Quebec, which was only the second time that they've been outside of Ottawa for sitting of cases. Some international associations and exchanges that they've done with other Supreme Courts from other countries. And then they listed significant cases. Now this is what I wanted to get to, because the significant case that they listed was one I mentioned a few weeks ago, the Bissonnette case. This is out of Quebec. The mosque shooter who was given consecutive ineligibility periods of parole. So wasn't going to be eligible for parole for basically his life. Supreme Court of Canada said that must be limited to, they have to be concurrent. 25 years is the maximum. And so that sort of reverberated and affected the Justin Bourque case out of New Brunswick, which generated lots of controversy. So I thought it was interesting that the Supreme Court of Canada highlighted this case, which generated a lot of publicity, controversy, opposition from opposition parties, and even lots of citizens. But I think it's an example of the Supreme Court of Canada asserting their independence. That was part of the message, and I think by pointing out this as a significant case, they're just sort of reinforcing that message. All right, last case I want to talk about, another case. This is also out of Ontario. I was reading, I go through different sources when I'm trying to piece these weekly briefs together. And one place I like to look is this Rudner Law Employment Law blog. Rudner, R-U-D-N-E-R, based out of Ontario. They do some Supreme Court work and great employment law resource. And this was an interesting case. Khan, K-H-A-N, was the defendant who refused to be examined for discovery after he consented to it in court that he was, yes, I'll show up for discovery to be examined. Multi-million-dollar case, a big litigation case in Ontario. And he was ordered to go to this discovery, refused. And this is a civil case, not a criminal case, but Justice Myers found him in contempt and sentenced him to 60 days in jail and $10,000 fine for just not showing up for an examination. Well, I guess that the court wanted to show how serious they were about it. So Khan can vary the sentence simply by appearing for his examination, which, geez, you'd think you would do right away. Otherwise, Justice Myers said, you will reappear here on day 59 of your sentence in court, and if you haven't agreed to it or appeared by then, guess what? You're going to be staying in court, most likely after that as well. So some serious case there, and just wanted to point out the employment law blog of Rudner Law there. Okay, last case I want to get to, and this is big Nova Scotia news this week, is a knife incident at CP Allen School. It was a 15-year-old student brought a knife into school. Now, the details are scant and hard to come by in some cases, but what I'm reading between the lines or hearing is that the student held the knife to his own throat first and seemed to be threatening self-harm, but then turned the knife on others. And I don't know all the circumstances, but two at least teachers, staff were injured and were hospitalized with serious injuries, although I think were not life-threatening injuries. So I heard the Teachers Union president. I happened to be in Halifax last Wednesday for court, and on the way in I heard the Teachers Union president, Ryan Lutz, I think is his name, interviewed on Todd Vino's show, and then actually in the afternoon as I was driving home, I heard him interviewed again on CBC Radio in the afternoon with Jeff Douglas. Anyway, didn't get the sense that he was either able or willing maybe to explain clearly what he wanted the government to do, what the teachers union wants or expects the government to do about these kind of situations. It was just a lot of vague talk, I thought, about developing a strategy, system-wide change. So really, like I said, limited insight into what the real problem was, or else just unwilling to say what he really thought, because what it seemed to be was, if just sort of reading between the lines a little bit, was hinting that the province should be paying teachers more to do more hallway supervision. So I wonder, I coach in the school system a little bit, and so I see this, that he was talking about teachers not being as connected to students as they were, not only within their own classrooms, but within the schools themselves, not doing hallway supervision. And I wonder if this is connected to some of the work to rule, pandemic effects, contract negotiations from before the pandemic on, additional duties that teachers perform all the time and maybe don't get paid for or appreciated sufficiently for. I think the teachers union is trying to suggest that teachers should be paid more for hallway supervision, and if they were, that these things wouldn't be such an issue. Well, if that's the case, come out and say so. Don't try to skate around it by, these talks about a strategy. And, if that's what you're saying, if that's what you're thinking, come out and say it. Okay. The incident itself has bothered me, and this is why. The Crown prosecutor has come out and said already that the Crown will be seeking an adult sentence for this 15-year-old. Now, some of the details we've heard is this would be the last person you'd expect. I've heard, you've seen some of those type remarks in some of the news reports. Like I say, apparently had a knife to his own throat first before turning it on anybody else. So tells me that there's something troubling going on there, mental health breakdown, something like that. The other thing we know is that the youth has not sought bail just yet. He has a legal aid lawyer, youth duty lawyer. Paul Shepard was one name I saw who's called to the bar in 2015, so 8 years in, well experienced. I suspect what's going on there is that it's just going to take a few days to put a plan together. Maybe get a mental health assessment done of this young guy. And the other issue might be that if the kid is having problems at home, then it may be an issue of trying to find another place to go, a place to be, an alternate place to stay, and which may not be easy under the circumstances with all the publicity. Maybe it's difficult to find a place for this person to live. But the adult sentence issue. Okay, so I see 2 counts each. The youth is being charged with 2 counts each of attempted murder, aggravated assault, possession of a weapon dangerous to the public, and carrying a concealed weapon. Now, that doesn't mean he's being charged with 8 different things. Those are 2 different things, 2 different people, and sort of alternate versions of the charge. So, all right, attempted murder, all right, if the court or the jury doesn't believe attempted murder, maybe they'll believe the next level or accept the next level that it's aggravated assault. If they don't accept that, well, possession of a weapon dangerous to the public. So these are just different levels of seriousness, alternative charges, not accumulating charges. All right, so there's 2 things, not even though there's 10 charges or so. In order to, so the youth sentence for attempted murder would be 3 years, 3 years in jail. Is that, so are they already, the Crown is already saying or suggesting that that's not enough? That seems like a premature determination. Not knowing a lot about this young person, not having a pre-sentence report, not having any mental health assessment done yet. Because in order to get an adult sentence, the Crown needs to, first of all, they need to do 2 things. They need to rebut the presumption that's in the Youth Criminal Justice Act that young people have a diminished moral culpability. All right, so that's, if you're younger, you just don't have the moral sense of these things yet. All right, the kid's 15. The second thing they need to show is that, he's not a 17-year-old on the edge of adulthood, on the edge of being an 18-year-old. He's 15. Secondly, they need to find that the available sentence is too short. 3 years in jail, 3 years in custody is not nothing. That's a serious time, especially for a 15-year-old in those crucial years of a person's life. So that seems like a premature determination. I think the Crown is doing this in the heat of the moment, and that is improperly, in the heat of the aftermath. And so they should wait, be patient, and make those determinations in the fullness of time as they learn more about the incident. So, real problem there I see, and so we'll be following that to see how that unfolds. And anyway, hopefully this young person has some good help and some good people around them that will get them out of whatever this crisis is they were facing. All right, so wanted to mention those things, and I'll be watching this week, of course, the Mass Casualty Commission update. On Wednesday, if people are interested, the Court of Appeal is doing a broadcast as well. I won't be able to watch it. I'm in court on Wednesday on another matter myself, but if people are interested, the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal is broadcasting a hearing. This is a human rights case in a sense. These were police officers who felt they were discriminated against because they had PTSD. And the question actually on the appeal, though, is whether it's a human rights case or a labor code case. Anyway, so may or may not be all that interesting, but if you like watching court, then that's an opportunity to watch something right here in Nova Scotia. And otherwise, we'll be watching on Thursday, like everybody else, at the Mass Casualty Commission when they release their findings. So went a little longer today, but some big stories on the go, and I think it was worthwhile. Hope everybody enjoyed that, and enjoy your weekend. A little bit of snow here in Nova Scotia on towards the end of March. Hopefully that's the end of the weather for us, but and we'll see you in April. So thanks for watching, listening, and we'll see you next time.